The day I received the keys to my Sunnyside Estates home was the proudest moment of my life. After 15 years of saving, countless overtime shifts, and giving up vacations, I had finally done it. I had purchased my dream home with the backyard swimming pool I had coveted since I was a child who could not afford swimming lessons. I remember standing in the empty living room, sunlight streaming through the large windows, illuminating the hardwood floors. Through the sliding glass doors, the afternoon sun reflected off the clear blue water of my very own pool. My real estate agent smiled as she watched me take it all in. The previous owners maintained the pool meticulously, she explained. All chemicals balanced, equipment regularly serviced. You are inheriting a perfect little paradise. She was right. The rectangular pool with its small diving board and elegant stone surround was everything I had ever wanted. I spent that first weekend doing nothing but floating on my back, staring at the clouds and savoring the feeling of accomplishment. The neighborhood seemed equally perfect. The lawns were well maintained. Neighbors introduced themselves with plates of cookies or offers to share gardening tips. Within the first month, I had been invited to 3 barbecues and a neighborhood watch meeting. Sunnyside Estates was managed by a homeowners association, which I initially appreciated. The monthly fees seemed reasonable for the well-maintained common areas and the sense of security they provided. The HOA president at that time was a retired judge named Robert, who welcomed me warmly at my first HOA meeting. "We are glad to have you join our community," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Let us know if you need anything as you settle in." For the first year, everything ran smoothly. I received occasional notices about proper trash can placement or suggestions about seasonal decorations, but nothing unreasonable. The trouble began when Robert announced his retirement and relocation to Florida. The election for the new board was held during a lightly attended summer meeting. I was out of town on business and missed it entirely. When I returned, there were already whispers about the new president, Karen Whitfield, and her aggressive approach to rule enforcement. It started with small things. The community newsletter tone changed from informative to threatening, filled with warnings about violations and increased fine schedules. Security patrols became more frequent, with volunteers taking photos of properties they deemed problematic. Still, I kept to myself, maintained my property meticulously, and enjoyed my private backyard pool during the hot summer months. Then came the envelope that changed everything. Official HOA letterhead, bold red text at the top reading "Violation Notice and Fine." I opened it, assuming it had been delivered to my address by mistake. It was not. The notice charged me with unauthorized pool usage during non-designated hours and levied a $150 fine. I read the notice 3 times, certain there must be some mistake. My pool, on my property, that I owned, had designated hours. Since when? I immediately called the number listed at the bottom of the notice. "I think there has been a mistake," I said calmly to the woman who answered. "I received a fine for using my own backyard pool." "Name and address?" she asked briskly. I provided the information. "No mistake, sir. The new board has implemented quiet hours for all water features. No pool usage before 10 a.m. or after 7 p.m. The rules were distributed last month." I felt my face grow hot. I never received any such notice, and furthermore, this is my private pool, not a community amenity. "The rules apply to all visible water features. The fine is due within 30 days, she replied mechanically. "Have a nice day." She hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, the notice trembling in my hands, as disbelief slowly transformed into something darker. Something that would eventually become the force behind the most drastic decision of my homeownership. The next morning, I pulled the thick binder of HOA bylaws from my office shelf. I had been given this document upon closing but had only skimmed it previously. Now, I spread the pages across my kitchen table and began methodically reading every section. Yellow highlighter in hand, I marked anything related to pools, property usage, or homeowner rights. Hours passed as I pored over the dense legal language. By noon, surrounded by paper and sticky notes, I had reached my conclusion. Nowhere in the bylaws did it state that the HOA had any jurisdiction over private pool usage hours. I made copies of the relevant sections, tucked them into a folder, and walked the 3 blocks to Corinne Whitfield's house. I had met her briefly at a community event but did not know her well. Her property was immaculate, with perfectly trimmed hedges and color-coordinated flower beds. I rang the doorbell and waited. When Corinne opened the door, her welcoming smile quickly faded upon recognizing me. "I received this fine for using my own pool," I stated, holding up the notice. "I have reviewed the bylaws thoroughly, and there is no mention of restricted hours for private pools. I would like this fine removed, please." Corinne stepped onto her porch, closing the door behind her. She wore a tennis outfit despite the cloudy weather. "The board has authority to implement community standards as needed," she replied dismissively. The newsletter outlined the new quiet hours policy. I produced my folder. I never received any newsletter with this information. Furthermore, the bylaws specifically state that any changes to property usage policies require a 2/3 vote from all homeowners, not just board decision. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "We operate under unwritten community standards as well. Your pool is visible from the street and several neighbors have complained about noise." She waved her hand as if shooing away an insect. "Pay the fine and adjust your swimming schedule accordingly. This is not negotiable." I stood my ground. "Please show me these complaints and the minutes from the meeting where this policy was enacted." "I do not have time for this right now," she replied coldly. "Follow the rules like everyone else or the fines will increase. That is how it works here." With that, she turned and went back inside, closing the door firmly. I walked home slowly, processing the encounter. Something did not add up. That evening I decided to speak with my neighbors. I started with Martha, whose property backed up to mine. We had occasionally chatted over the fence since I moved in. When I mentioned the pool fine, her expression changed immediately. "You too?" she asked quietly. We sat on her back patio as she explained. "Several of us have received similar notices. The Johnsons were fined for their fountain, the Garcias for their bird bath. Anything with water seems to be targeted, but only certain homes." "What do you mean, certain homes?" I asked. Martha leaned forward. "Have you noticed who never gets cited? Corinne and her friends from the tennis club. Elizabeth Green has a pond with koi that runs all night with lights and a waterfall. No fines. Craig Wilson has pool parties every weekend. No fines." Over the next few days, I spoke with more neighbors and discovered a clear pattern. Homes belonging to Corinne's social circle were exempt from the aggressive enforcement that the rest of us experienced. Several long-time residents were considering selling rather than deal with the harassment. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I arrived early, documentation in hand. The community center was unusually crowded. I recognized many faces from my recent conversations. Karen and 4 other board members sat at a long table facing the rows of chairs. I signed up to speak during the open forum section. After routine business, Corinne called my name with obvious reluctance. I approached the microphone and clearly presented my case regarding the pool fines, citing the relevant bylaw sections and questioning the selective enforcement. As I spoke, I noticed subtle glances exchanged between board members. When I finished, Karen smiled thinly. "Thank you for your concerns. The board will take them under advisement. Next speaker, please." "But there has been no response to my specific questions," I persisted. "This matter has been tabled indefinitely," she stated firmly. "Move along." Several other homeowners tried to raise similar concerns, all met with the same dismissive treatment. After the meeting, a small group gathered in the parking lot. We compared stories and realized the extent of what was happening. The new board had effectively created a two-tier system: preferential treatment for their friends and aggressive enforcement for everyone else. That night, I started a spreadsheet documenting every interaction, every notice, and every inconsistency I observed in the neighborhood. The battle lines had been drawn, but I had not yet realized how far this conflict would escalate, or what it would ultimately cost me. The weeks following the HOA meeting brought an escalation that I could never have anticipated. A second fine arrived, this one for $250, citing excessive water splashing onto deck area. I photographed the notice and added it to my growing documentation file. 3 days later, a third fine, $300 for unapproved pool toys visible from street view. The absurdity might have been comical if not for the mounting financial burden and stress. I began to notice unfamiliar cars driving slowly past my house. Twice, I caught people standing at the edge of my property taking photographs. When confronted, they identified themselves as HOA compliance officers, volunteers appointed by Karen to document violations. My backyard, once my sanctuary, now felt like a surveillance zone. I installed privacy curtains on the fence, only to receive another fine for unapproved fence modifications. The most disturbing escalation came in the form of a certified letter. The HOA was threatening to place a lien on my home for unpaid fines, which now totaled over $1,000. The letter stated that continued noncompliance would result in legal action and possible foreclosure proceedings. My stomach knotted as I read the words. Could they actually take my home over pool usage? The thought seemed preposterous, yet the official language and legal threats felt alarmingly real. I scheduled a meeting with the HOA board to appeal the fines. On the appointed day, I arrived with my documentation organized in a professional binder. Only 2 board members showed up, Karen and her friend Elizabeth. They listened impassively as I presented my case, pointing out the lack of bylaw support for their actions and the inconsistent enforcement throughout the neighborhood. "Your appeal is denied," Karen stated flatly when I finished. "Furthermore, the board has voted to increase the daily fine to $100 per day until compliance is achieved." "Compliance with what exactly?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice level. "There are no written rules about private pool hours in the bylaws." Elizabeth slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "The board has unanimously approved this addendum to the community standards. It is effective immediately." The document, dated the previous day, contained hastily created restrictions on private water features, including limited hours of operation, noise restrictions, and visible accessory limitations. I noted the convenient timing. This cannot be applied retroactively to justify fines already levied, I pointed out. Karen stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "The fines stand. Comply with the new standards or face the consequences." That evening, I called several lawyers before finding one who specialized in HOA disputes. Mark Reynolds agreed to meet with me the following day. His office was small but professional, with sunlight filtering through Venetian blinds and creating striped shadows across his desk. "Unfortunately, what you are describing is not uncommon," Mark explained after reviewing my documentation. "HOAs wield significant power, and boards can become tyrannical when left unchecked. The good news is that they have made several procedural errors that weaken their position. "So I can fight this?" I asked hopefully. Mark leaned back in his chair. "You can, but I want to be honest with you. HOA litigation is expensive and time-consuming. We could be looking at months, even years of legal battles. They have the community funds to fight you. Do you have the resources to fight back?" The answer was no. I had invested nearly everything in my home. A protracted legal battle would be financially devastating. I left Mark's office with his card and a heaviness in my chest. That night, I sat by my pool, watching the moonlight reflect off the water that had once brought me such joy, but now represented an ongoing source of stress. The final breaking point came during the 4th of July weekend. I had invited family over for a modest celebration, including my young nieces and nephews who were excited to swim. We were preparing food when a sharp knock came at the door. An HOA compliance officer stood there with a notice declaring my pool closed for inspection due to reported chemical imbalance concerns. He proceeded to zip-tie a laminated closure notice to my pool gate. My brother-in-law confronted him. "You cannot just close a private pool without testing it. What authority do you have?" The man shrugged. "I just deliver the notices, sir. Take it up with the board." He walked away as my family stood in shocked silence. The children's disappointed faces as they stared through the fence at the forbidden water broke something inside me. My youngest niece tugged at my hand. "Why are those people so mean, Uncle? It is your pool." I had no good answer for her. That night after my family left, I sat alone in my backyard. The chemical testing kit showed perfect balance, as I knew it would. This had never been about safety or community standards. It was about power and control. As I stared at the moonlight on the forbidden water, something inside me hardened into resolve. This could not continue. If they wanted a war over my pool, I would give them one, but not in the way they expected. The next morning, I called in sick to work and began researching property laws with renewed determination. If traditional appeals were futile and legal battles too costly, there had to be another solution. I spent hours on legal websites, homeowner forums, and property rights databases. My dining room table disappeared under printouts, legal documents, and county code regulations. By mid-afternoon, I found something promising. While HOAs have broad authority over the exterior appearance of homes, there are limitations to their power. Specifically, I discovered that state law protected homeowners' rights to make safety-related modifications to their property, even if those modifications conflicted with HOA aesthetic guidelines. I focused my research on pool safety codes. According to county regulations, unused pools must either be properly maintained or permanently decommissioned according to specific safety standards. The key word was permanently. If a pool became a financial burden or safety concern, the homeowner had the legal right to decommission it following county safety procedures, regardless of HOA aesthetic preferences. This was my loophole. The HOA could make using my pool impossible, but they could not force me to keep an unused pool if I decided to properly decommission it. Furthermore, if I could prove the decommissioning was necessary due to their actions, I might have grounds for recovering the costs. I needed allies. I called Martha and asked if she would be willing to host a small gathering of affected neighbors. 2 days later, 8 homeowners sat in Martha's living room sharing stories of HOA harassment. The Johnsons had been fined for their children playing in their sprinkler. The Garcias had received violations for their bird bath attracting excessive wildlife. Each story reinforced the pattern of selective enforcement and overreach. "I think I have found a way to fight back," I explained, outlining my research findings. What they never expect is for someone to follow their unreasonable demands to the extreme logical conclusion. Greg Johnson, a retired contractor, nodded thoughtfully. It is bold, I will give you that. And legally, they cannot stop you if you have the proper permits and follow safety codes. But your pool, Martha said softly. You love that pool, it seems so drastic. Sometimes you have to sacrifice something to make a larger point, I replied. Besides, I have an idea for phase 2, but I need your support. The group agreed to help document the pattern of selective enforcement. Each would keep detailed records of violations given and not given throughout the neighborhood. We would build an irrefutable case of discriminatory practices. The next step required professional assistance. I contacted 3 pool contractors, explaining that I wanted to explore options for properly decommissioning my pool. The first 2 seemed confused by my request. Most of their business involved installation or renovation, not removal. The third contractor, Dave Martinez, understood immediately. Planning to move? He asked during his inspection. No, I replied honestly. Just tired of dealing with HOA harassment over it. Dave nodded knowingly. I have done 5 decommissioning jobs in HOA communities in the last year alone. People get tired of fighting. He walked the perimeter of the pool, taking measurements and notes. There are 2 approaches: drain and fill with dirt, which is cheaper, or drain and fill with concrete, which is more permanent and meets higher safety standards. We discussed the options, costs, and timeline. Dave provided a detailed quote for both options, along with the necessary permit information. I thanked him and spent the evening creating spreadsheets comparing the cost of decommissioning versus continuing to pay escalating fines. The financial calculations were clear. At the current rate of fines, decommissioning would pay for itself within months. The final decision came when another certified envelope arrived. This one contained a $1,000 fine for excessive noise from pool use during restricted hours. The specific violation cited children laughing and splashing during my family gathering, before the pool had even been used. It was fabricated evidence to support a baseless fine. I stood in my kitchen, the notice trembling in my hand, not from fear but from a cold, calculated anger. I walked to my backyard and stared at the pool, my dream, my achievement, the symbol of everything I had worked for. The water reflected my face, distorted by gentle ripples. At that moment, I made my decision. I would rather eliminate my pool entirely than continue to be extorted for using it. I picked up my phone and called Dave. I would like to proceed with the concrete option, I told him. The most permanent solution possible, and I need to document everything for legal purposes. Understood, he replied. I will file the permits tomorrow. Are you absolutely sure about this? I took one last look at my beautiful pool, knowing it would soon be gone forever. Yes, I answered firmly. It is time. The permits were approved with surprising speed. Perhaps the county officials had dealt with similar HOA disputes before and recognized the urgency. I scheduled the work for the following Monday, deliberately choosing a day when most of my neighbors would be home. Dave assured me his crew could complete the decommissioning in a single day if everything went according to plan. I spent the weekend preparing. I purchased a high-definition video camera and several memory cards. I made copies of all permits and county approvals and displayed them prominently in my front windows. I notified my allies in the neighborhood of the plan so they could serve as witnesses if needed. I even hired a notary to be present during the process to document everything legally. Monday morning arrived with perfect clarity. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when the first trucks rumbled down my street. Neighbors peeked through curtains as flatbeds loaded with equipment and concrete mixers parked along my driveway. I stood in my front yard wearing a business suit. I wanted to look professional for the documentation and began videotaping. Today is Monday, August 10th, 8:15 a.m., I narrated clearly for the camera. I am documenting the legal decommissioning of my private swimming pool in accordance with County Safety Code Section 511.3. All necessary permits have been obtained and are displayed in my front window. Dave arrived with his crew of 6 workers who immediately began setting up equipment. The pool would be drained, the pump and filtration systems properly removed, and then filled with concrete to create a permanently sealed flat surface that eliminated any drowning hazard. The draining process began first. Large hoses snaked from my backyard to the street drainage system. I continued documenting every step, including close-ups of the permits and the workers following safety protocols. Neighbors began to gather at the edges of my property, whispering among themselves. I noticed Martha giving me a thumbs up from her driveway. It was nearly noon when Karen's silver Mercedes screeched to a halt in front of my house. She emerged wearing a tennis skirt and a look of absolute fury. She marched directly toward me, ignoring the workers and equipment. "What do you think you are doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I kept the camera rolling. "Hello, Karen. I am decommissioning my pool in accordance with county safety regulations. Would you like to see the permits?" My voice remained calm and steady. "You cannot do this," she sputtered. "The HOA has not approved any modifications to your property." I gestured toward the notary, who stood nearby with a clipboard. "This is Ms. Peterson, a licensed notary documenting these proceedings. She has copies of the relevant state laws and county codes that explicitly state homeowners have the right to make safety modifications regardless of HOA aesthetic restrictions. Would you like to review them?" Karen ignored the offered documents. "I am calling the police," she announced, pulling out her phone. "That would be helpful, thank you," I replied pleasantly. "They can verify that all permits are in order." Her face reddened further. "Stop the work immediately or face additional fines." "I am afraid that is not possible," I explained. "The county inspector will be arriving at 2 p.m. to verify the decommissioning meets safety standards. Stopping now would put me in violation of county code." A police cruiser arrived 20 minutes later. Officer Rodriguez listened patiently as Karen demanded the work be stopped. He then reviewed my permits and documentation. "Everything appears to be in order," he confirmed. "The homeowner has the proper permits and is following county safety protocols. This is not a police matter." He turned to Karen. "The county supersedes HOA regulations when it comes to safety modifications, ma'am." Karen was undeterred. She made frantic phone calls, and soon other board members arrived, creating a small crowd of onlookers. Elizabeth attempted to intimidate the work crew, but Dave politely referred her back to me. The concrete trucks arrived at 1:30 p.m., their drums rotating slowly as they backed into position. The county inspector, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Reyes, arrived precisely at 2 p.m. She performed a thorough inspection of the draining process and reviewed the concrete specifications. "All in compliance," she noted on her clipboard before providing an official approval for the filling to begin. The concrete began flowing at 2:30 p.m. I stood silently watching as the gray mixture poured into my empty pool, covering the blue tile, the small diving board, the underwater lights. Years of savings and dreams disappeared under the thick gray sludge. Karen and her group watched from the street, their expressions a mixture of shock and anger as they realized they could not stop what was happening. By sunset, the job was complete. Where my beautiful pool had once sparkled in the sunlight, there was now a flat concrete pad, properly textured for drainage and sealed according to code. Ms. Reyes returned for a final inspection and provided the certificate of completion, which I immediately added to my documentation binder. As the trucks and workers departed, I stood alone in my backyard. The loss felt real and painful. The concrete pad seemed to mock me, a gray monument to a battle I never wanted to fight. And yet, beneath the sense of loss, I felt something else stirring, a quiet determination. The HOA had pushed me to destroy something I loved, but they had unknowingly given me the weapon I needed to fight back. Martha appeared at the back gate. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. I nodded slowly. "Phase 1 is complete," I replied, running my hand over the still warm concrete. "Now we begin Phase 2. The morning after the pool was sealed, I began preparing my counterstrike. Using the detailed records from Dave's company, I created a comprehensive invoice. Every cost was meticulously itemized: permits, labor, materials, equipment rental, concrete, professional fees, inspections, and the notary services. The total came to $23,475.86. At the bottom, I added a line for administrative fees and documentation costs, totaling $1,500, exactly matching the cumulative HOA fines I had received. I contacted Mark Reynolds, my attorney, and explained what I had done and what I planned next. He listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "It is aggressive," he admitted, "but legally sound if you can prove the decommissioning was necessitated by their harassment. The documentation you have collected will be crucial." We spent 3 hours preparing the legal letter that would accompany my invoice. The language was precise and unemotional, citing relevant laws, codes, and HOA bylaw violations. The letter formally demanded payment for costs incurred due to continuous harassment, selective rule enforcement, and creation of conditions that rendered the private pool unusable for its intended purpose. Mark added a paragraph about potential litigation for discriminatory practices and abuse of authority if the matter was not resolved within 30 days. With the invoice and legal letter prepared, I arranged for it to be delivered via certified mail requiring signature confirmation. I wanted official documentation of its receipt. The thick packet was sent directly to the HOA's registered address, addressed to the board as a whole rather than to Karen specifically. This was not personal, it was business. While waiting for the HOA's response, I implemented the second phase of my plan. I had been collecting evidence of selective enforcement from my neighbors for weeks. Now it was time to share that information with the entire community. I created a simple, fact-based email detailing the pattern of discrimination with specific examples, dates, and photographic evidence. I included side-by-side comparisons showing identical violations that resulted in fines for some homeowners, but were ignored for board members and their friends. "This is not about my pool," I wrote in the conclusion. "This is about fairness, transparency, and proper governance of our community. Every homeowner deserves equal treatment under the bylaws we all agreed to when purchasing our homes." I sent the email to every homeowner in Sunnyside Estates using the community directory. Within hours, my phone began ringing with messages of support. Many residents shared their own stories of unfair treatment. Some admitted they had been afraid to speak up for fear of retaliation. The community was finally having the conversation that had been suppressed for months. 3 days after sending my invoice, I received word that an emergency HOA board meeting had been called. The community center was packed beyond capacity when I arrived. Karen and the other board members sat at their usual table, but their usual confidence was noticeably absent. A man in an expensive suit sat beside them, their attorney, I presumed. Karen attempted to call the meeting to order, but the crowd's murmuring continued. She banged her gavel repeatedly with increasing force. "This meeting will come to order," she demanded, her voice strained. An elderly resident named Mr. Patel stood up without being recognized. "Before we begin, I would like to know why the board has been selectively enforcing rules against certain homeowners while ignoring violations by others." His question was met with applause and murmurs of agreement. Karen's face flushed. "We are here to discuss a specific legal matter, not to hear complaints." "But that is exactly the problem," Martha called out from her seat. "You never hear our complaints. You dictate rather than represent." For the next hour, homeowner after homeowner stood to share their experiences. The Garcia family described being fined for their birdbath, while board member Craig Wilson maintained an unapproved fountain. The Johnsons detailed how their children were prohibited from using water toys in their yard, while Karen's grandchildren played freely with a water slide at her home the previous weekend. Throughout this procession of testimonies, I observed the HOA attorney leaning over frequently to whisper to Karen and the other board members. Their expressions grew increasingly concerned as the pattern of discrimination became undeniable. When the crowd finally quieted, the attorney cleared his throat and addressed the room. "The board will need to enter executive session to discuss these matters privately," he announced. "This meeting is temporarily adjourned." The board members and their attorney retreated to a smaller room, leaving the residents to speculate among themselves. I remained silent, watching the community find its collective voice. Whatever happened next, something fundamental had changed in Sunnyside Estates. The fear had lifted. The isolation had ended. Even if my invoice was rejected, that victory could not be undone. After nearly an hour, the board returned. Karen no longer sat in the center chair. Instead, the HOA attorney addressed the assembly. "The board has voted to take these matters under serious review," he stated carefully. "A formal response to all concerns will be provided within 2 weeks." As the meeting disbanded, I noticed Karen standing alone, her usual confident posture replaced by something more defensive. For the first time since this conflict began, she looked uncertain. The power dynamic had shifted. Now we waited to see how complete that shift would be. The formal response arrived sooner than expected. 5 days after the emergency meeting, a courier delivered a thick envelope to my door. I signed for it with steady hands, though my heart raced. Inside was an official letter on legal stationery and a check. The Sunnyside Estates Homeowners Association Board of Directors has voted to settle all claims related to your property at 1423 Sunnyside Lane, the letter began. It continued with legal language acknowledging that proper procedures had not been followed in the creation and enforcement of certain rules. The check was made out to me for the full amount of my invoice, $24,975.86. Additionally, the letter confirmed that all outstanding fines against my property had been rescinded and removed from HOA records. Most surprisingly, the final paragraph announced the resignations of Karen Whitfield, Elizabeth Green, and Craig Wilson from the HOA board, effective immediately. A separate community newsletter arrived the same day, announcing a special election to fill the vacant board positions. The interim board chair, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Patel who had spoken up at the meeting, encouraged all interested homeowners to consider running for these important positions. I sat on my back porch, staring at the gray concrete pad that had once been my beloved pool with mixed emotions. The victory felt substantial, yet bittersweet. I had won, but at a significant personal cost. Still, the principle had been worth defending. No one should be bullied in their own home, even by those with seemingly legitimate authority. Over the next weeks, the community began to heal. The special election brought in 3 new board members who campaigned on platforms of transparency, fairness, and community input. The new board's first action was to create an oversight committee composed of non-board homeowners to review all proposed rule changes and fine assessments. I used a portion of the settlement money to hire a landscape architect. Where my pool had once been, we designed a beautiful meditation garden with a small flowing fountain, stone pathways, and native plants that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. In some ways, this peaceful space brought me more joy than the pool ever had. It represented not just a personal victory, but a community transformation. New neighbors who moved in that fall stopped by to introduce themselves. Everyone talks about how different the neighborhood feels now, one of them mentioned. They say it used to be tense and divided, but now it feels like a real community. My final encounter with Karen happened unexpectedly at the local grocery store. I turned down the cereal aisle and suddenly found myself face to face with her. For a moment, we both froze. She looked different somehow, smaller, less intimidating. Her eyes darted away, unwilling to meet mine directly. "Hello, Karen," I said simply. She nodded stiffly. "Your garden looks nice," she said after an uncomfortable pause. "Better than the pool." Without waiting for my response, she pushed her cart past me and disappeared around the corner. I did not offer forgiveness. Some actions leave marks too deep for simple reconciliation. But I did offer acknowledgement, a recognition that our conflict had changed both of us, and perhaps the community, for the better. That evening, I sat in my meditation garden as the sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The small fountain bubbled pleasantly, attracting birds that hopped and splashed in its shallow basin. My pool was gone, but in its place was something unexpected, a deeper appreciation for what home truly means. Not just the physical structure, but the right to peace, dignity, and fair treatment within one's own domain. Sometimes standing your ground means knowing which battles are worth fighting, even at great personal cost. My backyard would never be the same, but neither would our community. And that, I decided as twilight settled over Sunnyside Estates, was a trade well worth making.